Welcome to 1189, an online Bible commentary. My name is Tyler Marston, and today we're taking a look at Matthew chapter 22. So let's remember, in the last chapter, Jesus arrived in Jerusalem, and he got to his second day teaching in the temple where he rebuked all of the priests. Some of the priests are Pharisees, some are Sadducees, some fall somewhere in between, right? Some belong to other sects of Judaism, but they all have some sort of bone to pick with Jesus about how he does things. Now, as a result of the Hellenization of the region, these public philosophical debates in the style of the Greeks had become an important way for the Jews to talk about theology. Chapter 22 paints a fantastic picture of what this might have looked like as the Pharisees and Sadducees question and attempt to trap Jesus. However, Jesus makes incredible defenses and silences his opposition with a question of his own, proving himself to be the most educated, most scripturally sound Jew in the whole temple. Jesus spoke to them again in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son. And he sent out his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding feast, and they were unwilling to come. Again, he sent out other slaves, saying, 'Tell those who have been invited, behold, I have prepared my dinner, my oxen and my fattened livestock are all butchered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding feast.' But they paid no attention and went their way, one to his farm, another to his business, and the rest seized his slaves and mistreated them and killed them. But the king was enraged, and he sent his armies and destroyed those murderers and set their city on fire." Through a parable, Jesus continues his stern rebuke of the priests. People like the Pharisees and Sadducees who practice outward self-righteousness by cultural standards, but don't actually transform their hearts and minds to act like God. And he says those people are like guests that have been invited to a prince's wedding feast that are either completely indifferent or openly hostile about the invitation. Now, Jesus warns and says that those murderers and their city will be set on fire. Now, on one level, this does refer to God's final judgment of everyone on the earth. But on the other hand, let's not forget that he's specifically talking to the priests of first century Israel, who very literally, in just a few decades, will see their city set on fire. Jesus is making an oracle about the coming Jewish-Roman war that lasts from AD 66 to 70. And not only is it going to result in the destruction of Jerusalem, it's going to result in the destruction of the very temple that they're standing in. Jesus continues the parable. "Then he said to his slaves, 'The wedding is ready, but those who were invited were not worthy. Go therefore to the main highways, and as many as you find there, invite to the wedding feast.' Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered together all they found, both evil and good, and the wedding hall was filled with dinner guests." And so as a result of the guests who were invited rejecting their invitation, rejecting the king sends out his servants to find anyone they can and bring them to the feast. Anyone, regardless of social status or family ties. And it illustrates how the Jews' rejection of Jesus as Israel's true king leads to the inclusion of all of the families of the earth. But when the king came in to look over the dinner guests, he saw a man there who was not dressed in wedding clothes. And he said to him, "Friend, how did you come in here without wedding clothes?" And the man was speechless. Then the king said to his servants, "Bind him hand and foot and throw him into outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen." However, since it can't be as simple as "you're Jewish, so you're good," it also can't be as simple as "you're not Jewish, so you're good." Right? At the end of the day, it comes down to each individual's choice about whether they believe Jesus is the Messiah and whether they will let God transform them into a new creation. Or as the parable puts it, whether they choose to put on wedding clothes. The parable is drawing on places like Zechariah 3 and Genesis 3, where the garment someone wears metaphorically illustrates their standing before God. Then the Pharisees went and plotted together how they might trap him in what he said. And they sent their disciples to him, along with the Herodians, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are truthful and teach the way of God in truth and defer to no one, for you are not partial to any. Tell us then, what do you think? Is it lawful to give the poll tax to Caesar or not?" So the Pharisees come up to Jesus. Remember, they're the educated sect. They believe that hyper-literal adherence to every letter of the Mosaic Law will bring about deliverance for Israel. They've been beefing with Jesus for his whole ministry, and so after being so criticized by him, they try to set him in a trap. The Pharisees are very anti-Rome, right? They see them as no different than the pagan emperors and rulers who have ruled over the Jewish homeland in years past. But they can't exactly come out and say not to pay taxes to a corrupt Rome, because that would get them very quickly arrested. And so the Pharisees are attempting to put Jesus in this same tension. They're trying to get him to either publicly, treasonously denounce paying taxes to the Roman overlords, or to endorse and support the obviously corrupt Caesar and lose credibility with his audience. But Jesus perceived their malice and said, "Why are you testing me, you hypocrites? Show me the coin used for the poll tax." And they came and brought him a denarius. And he said to them, "Whose likeness and inscription is this?" They said to him, "Caesar's." Then he said to them, "Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And hearing this, they were amazed, and leaving him, they went away. Jesus gives a brilliant answer to this question by refocusing the listener on true godliness. Caesar's coin is just money, right? Its value was created by the person who stamped his own image on it. So you can feel free to pay taxes, and in fact, you should, because you'll get arrested if you don't. But also be sure to give God the thing that God stamped his image on, and that's your very life and being. On that day, some Sadducees, who say that there is no resurrection, came to Jesus and questioned him, asking, "Teacher, Moses said, if a man dies having no children, his brothers as next of kin shall marry his wife and raise up children for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers with us, and the first married and died, and having no children left his wife to his brother. So also the second and the third down to the 7th. Last of all, the woman died. So in the resurrection, therefore, whose wife of the 7 will she be? For they all had married her." So when the Pharisees fail to trap Jesus, the Sadducees step in. They're the elite sect, the wealthy aristocracy. They were the Roman sympathizers that were given authority to operate in the temple by the empire. And famously, they taught that there's no final resurrection in the end. Once you're dead, you're dead. New Testament scholar N.T. Wright concludes that the Sadducees didn't believe in a final resurrection because they didn't need the hope that a resurrection offered. They had all their needs met in the life they presently had. Their trap for Jesus involves a question that's meant to evoke a perceived logical error in the concept of a resurrection. Deuteronomy 25 instructs family members to take care of their deceased brothers' wives by marrying them into their family. So if a woman ends up with all of these husbands, whose wife will she be in the resurrection? Now, if Jesus can't provide an answer, he'll again lose credibility with his audience and support the Sadducean idea that final resurrection is absurd. But Jesus answered and said to them, "You are mistaken, not understanding the Scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven." Jesus' response again works and amazes the crowd. The eternal life given to us by God will be physical and bodily, but it won't be exactly like it is here on earth right now. Jesus says there's not going to be marriage per se in heaven, right? Just like how angels don't get married because they don't need to sexually reproduce. On the contrary, the reason we get married today, now, is as a picture of that life to come, portraying the way Christ will metaphorically marry his church in the final days. But regarding the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was spoken to you by God? I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. When the crowds heard this, they were astonished at his teaching. Jesus further reinforces the doctrine of a final resurrection by citing Exodus 3. There, God claims to be the present tense God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all of whom have long been dead. So how could the God of life be the God of the dead patriarchs unless they weren't meant to stay dead? But when the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered themselves together. One of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him. "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" And he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend the whole law and prophets. So after silencing the Sadducees, the Pharisees have regrouped and come up with another test for Jesus. This time they ask what the greatest commandment is, assuming that whichever one he picks will leave out some essential part of the scriptures. And that will give them a foothold to defame him and make him lose credibility with the crowd. Now Jesus answers with the 1-2 punch of Deuteronomy 6:5 and Leviticus 19:8. He says that all of the commandments in all of the Old Testament hinge on those two ideas. Loving God with everything you have and loving your neighbor like you love yourself. And it makes sense, right? I mean, how could you covet or commit adultery without also not loving your neighbor? How could you worship an idol or break sacrificial practices without also not loving God? And so once again, Jesus evades the trap that's set for him. Now, while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them a question. What do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he? They said to him, the son of David. Now it's Jesus' turn to offer a challenge of his own. He asks who the Christ is, right? Who the Messiah is. The Pharisees respond that it's the son of David, right? And what they mean by that is it's a future king from the Davidic line who will inherit the throne and liberate Israel. He said to them, then how does David in the Spirit call him Lord, saying, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies beneath your feet. If David then calls him Lord, how is he his son? And Jesus brings up Psalm 110, in which David is writing about the Messiah. David calls the Messiah his Lord, his Adonai, which is distinct from, but equal in position to, the all caps Lord, the substitution for the name of God, Yahweh. Jesus is saying that the Christ, the Messiah, will be the kingly offspring of David, but he's also something greater than David. And he's also somehow equal in position to God himself. Now the answer to that mystery is the person of Jesus himself, but no one is quite able to figure that out yet. No one was able to answer him a word, nor did anyone dare from that day on to ask him another question. And so the Pharisees and Sadducees really realize how educated Jesus is in the scriptures. They can't trap him in confusion or heresy like they've done to other people who didn't agree with their views. To really shut him up, they'll have to concoct some other kind of scheme. One that might be a little more devious and sinister. The priests during this time prided themselves on being the most godly, right? The people that knew the most scripture. But they could not compete with the knowledge of Jesus. Meanwhile, Jesus has both the humility to lead and serve the common people, while also having the confidence to speak authoritatively on the scriptures, neither of which the priests really have. All in all, they show us attributes to avoid: self-righteousness, hypocrisy, arrogance. On the other hand, Jesus shows us attributes to emulate: wisdom, mercy for all people, humility, and confidence in God and in God alone. Thanks for watching 1189. I hope you have a good day, and God bless.